Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander Eth, and today we are very excited to talk about the Book of Oberon, British Magic, and 19th Century Balloonists with author, scholar, and a true master of library science, Mr. Daniel Harms. Daniel holds master's degrees in anthropology and library and information science. He's been published in the Journal for the Academic Study of Magic and the Journal of Scholarly Publishing, and he's authored books on folklore and horror fiction, and many listeners are familiar with Daniel's presentation of the Book of Oberon, a sourcebook of Elizabethan magic, presented along with Joseph H. Peterson and the illustrator James R. Clark, which was a defining text of English-based ceremonial magic that draws from and refines or adds to other grimoire sources in the previous centuries. And in today's day and age, it definitely helps illuminate those historic tributaries. In this episode, Daniel shares about working through and presenting the Book of Oberon. We discuss its relation to Shakespeare, to fairy magic, and Catholicism. Daniel also shares about his quests in researching manuscripts and his work entitled Of Angels, Demons, and Spirits, a Sourcebook of British Magic. We also ascend to the heavens themselves with Daniel's fantastic book, Balloonists, Alchemists, and Astrologers of the 19th Century, The Tale of George and Margaret Graham. This is an episode that traverses magical space-time and one you definitely don't want to miss. And Glitch Bottle patrons can also hear even more excellent insights from Daniel as well. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, I give you Mr. Daniel Harms. Daniel Harms, thank you so much for stopping by the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I guess, can we just start, Daniel, in terms of your background? You definitely, have degrees in anthropology and library and information science, but when did your interest, Daniel, first really start to take root in terms of manuscript research, in terms of exploring the esoteric? Was this something from a very early age, or how did that start?
Oddly enough, it starts with H.P. Lovecraft, because I was growing up in a small town in Kentucky, and I was really into role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons, which then got me into the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, which got me into Lovecraft. And of course, Lovecraft is writing about all these tomes of magic that will blast the sanity of anyone who reads them. And he's talking a lot about anthropology and these anthropologists who go into strange areas and research weird cults and things like that. So I decided this was something I was interested in doing. I did get a master's in anthropology. I didn't pursue it further. What came away from that was an understanding of, something about the anthropology of magic, a fascination with the written record, because I could start accessing some of these. At this point, it was just the published material, because I didn't know so much about the manuscript grimoires, nor did I have the means to see many of them. But as time went on, I started to really say, okay, this is something I think I want to pursue, which led me to it's not my first book, but it's my first book on the topic of magic, which was a new edition of The Long Lost Friend by John George Holman. And then I started realizing that there's also a manuscript tradition out there. So I sort of fell into it. I am not, just to be clear, formally trained in manuscript reading or manuscript curation or anything like that. This is something that I had interest. My interest led me to a particular area, and then I did my best to develop the skill set that would allow me to access this material and, bring it to a broader public.
When it comes to library sciences, can you share about how did you get interested in that, especially in the digital age, where, as you know, everyone's doing things online, but yet the book itself has this allure to it as well. How did you get into that?
It did not take as much thought as I would really like to pretend that it did. There was a point after I left graduate school when I moved to Pittsburgh, and I was doing data entry for a law firm. And I was talking with one of my friends who was actually a librarian on the corporate side. And he said, Dan, you are really good at finding information. Why don't you just try library school? And so I was like, okay, I think there's a library school down the street, which was pretty much effectively true. But you're in Pittsburgh. If you're in Oakland, there, the UPitt Library School is, maybe a couple of blocks away from one of the main drags. And I decided, I'll just put in there and I'll go part-time and, we'll just see how it goes. And then they got back to me and said, okay, we're going to offer you a partial scholarship, but you have to go full-time. And I said, well, I guess now I'm committed now. It was a great experience there. And then I was able to get a job at an academic library, which I knew that I wanted to do because, there's a number of different ways you can take a library degree. But in this particular case, I knew I wanted to go back to academia. And that was something of a slog to get to academia. And it was something of a slog to get to the 10-year equivalent in our particular system. But it was an ultimately satisfying and rewarding job for me.
To that point, Daniel, if you'll permit me to read from the introduction of the Book of Oberon, a sourcebook of Elizabethan Magic, where you say, quote, "It was summer in Washington, D.C., and I was late to my demon hunt. I walked quickly down Pennsylvania Avenue from Washington Circle, stopping only briefly to pick up a late breakfast sandwich. Tourists were photographing themselves in front of the White House, but I hurried past towards the Capitol. The trees on Capitol Hill provided welcome moments of shade as I skirted the House chambers. Behind the building was a block mostly taken up by the Adams Building of the Library of Congress, its doors bearing reliefs of the gods of writing and scholarship, Nabu, Thoth, and Quetzalcoatl. I hoped they would smile upon me that day." And of course, I know many listeners are familiar with the Book of Oberon, but can you share about not only how you first came upon this text, but about that sense of, I guess that sense of like scholarly adventure? Like, do you feel that a lot when you're kind of delving into these manuscripts?
It's not quite to that. There's not a huge thrill about it these days, but there's still a thrill. I've started to learn there's a lot of bureaucracy associated with it. There's a lot of the need to make sure that, okay, is the library open? Do you have the proper paperwork? Do I need to get a letter from the college certifying that I'm a faculty member there? There is still that sense of excitement when it comes to visiting a new library. Of course, I think part of the problem on that day, I'm trying to remember what exactly I wrote in Oberon in that introduction. But part of the problem was I decided that on that day, this was one of my first trips to a special collection at an institution where I wasn't affiliated at that point. And so I was like, I better wear a suit. And of course, this is not something that's usually expected of people going to special collections. I usually try to wear some nice slacks and button-down shirt. So I'm running through Washington, D.C. in a suit. It's hot and muggy, and I didn't need to do that. But you get in there and suddenly you realize, I'm looking at something that's really, really great. But sort of that's only the tip, right? Because there's only so much work you can do within one of the special collections. A lot of the work is something that happens after you come back. You've taken some pictures, which they're usually very good about giving people permissions to take pictures for their own scholarly use, and that, not something you would use to sell something or put up online or something like that. Once you've got a bunch of images and you've got a good idea of what to look for, and then you can go back, and that's where the real work in some senses starts, because you then have to start going through everything that you've got and seeing what exactly was it that's so unique about this particular manuscript. You can catch pieces of that during what these special collections visits, which are often sort of surveys in terms of, okay, it looks like an interesting thing in the catalog. It says it's a key of Solomon, but what does that actually mean? I found, for example, that you don't trust anything that says it's just a key of Solomon. You got to go look at it because it could be anything. Once you identify them, you can then say, okay, I'm going to go back. I'm going to look at the pictures I took. Maybe I'm going to order images of another manuscript. they're reasonably priced these days if you don't intend to publish them. Then you really get into it.
But even though, as you mentioned, most of the work happens when you come back, you made that sojourn, that journey to the Folger Shakespeare Library. And you mentioned that this was founded by Henry Clay Folger, a nephew of the famous, of course, coffee entrepreneur. But can you tell us about how did you first come across this manuscript? And then when did you kind of realize, oh, I think there's something here that maybe hasn't been presented at all in this way before?
Well, one of the ways that I often find manuscripts to look into is the work of other scholars. And in this particular case, I think her name is Barbara Moat, had written an article called Prospero's Book, which just dealt with the fact that, Oberon is in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and we have this manuscript in our library which seems to refer to this spirit known as Oberon, which is one letter off, which also says that he's the king of the fairies. And there were also some images in the article, and I said, okay, I'm not seeing this sort of material in other manuscripts, because as those who have the Book of Oberon know, there's some really unusual pictures of spirits in there, some of which I'm still wondering where exactly they came from. The sad thing is they probably copied from other works, probably other printed works. But once I had that, I could say, okay, well, is this actually rises to the level where I may want to go and look at it. The United States does not have great centers for manuscripts of magic in the same sense that the UK does, or other parts of Europe, which I'm not going to comment on because I have not necessarily been to a good number of European special collections. So when you find something, it's usually sort of in isolation, and there may be a couple of manuscripts at the Folger Shakespeare Library which were of interest, but at the same time, it's a little bit easier to get to Washington, D.C. than it is to get to Oxford or London. So I went down and I took a look and I said, okay, I feel like I do not have the skill set yet to be able to approach this, but I'm going to give it a shot. And so it was interesting that particular day because, once again, me not knowing how these things really worked at the time, I came in and I asked for the manuscript, and they said, well, we didn't actually pull it yet. So that was one thing I learned to do, which is let them know in advance what exactly I'm interested in so they can have it ready. And they said, well, we've got this microfilm downstairs, so you could probably just take a look at it on the microfilm. I'm like, microfilm? Because even as a librarian, I really dislike microfilm. It's a very clunky sort of technology. I had experiences in undergraduate where the film would fly off the reel across the room and things like that. And it's just not something you really want to get along with and deal with unless you really have to. But at this point, I was like, okay, I'm in DC. I got to wait for the manuscript. I'm going to go look at that microfilm. I can tell you something. Whoever was filming the microfilm for the Shakespeare Library, that was the best microfilm ever. It was actually so good that it is clearer than the images of Folger VB26 that have been put online by the library.
Wow. Was that just the imaging that was used, like the technology, or what made it so high resolution? I
cannot say what that is because I've never gotten that far into, the actual filming of microfilm or anything like that. That is something that is handled by other people. Usually I think we sent things out of house in our own library. But I don't know what they did, but they did it really well. It even was able to catch red text, which I found is from some other sort of manuscripts that I've ordered from other libraries from what they filmed from microfilm, because a lot of this stuff at this point has been previously put on microfilm, which makes it a lot cheaper in order to order copies, because they can, the library can just go through and they can, run the microfilm through a scanner, and then they could just, give you a copy of that PDF. But a lot of those, they miss the red text because it's not set properly. So if you've got a diagram which has red elements, or if you've got a red name and text, it just doesn't show up. This one had everything. I was actually working on this for when we were doing our initial transcription of Oberon. I can't believe I'm going on about microfilm like this, but this is something that was really special. And it turned out that in a lot of places that microfilm was clearer than what you could see in the full color text. I was really glad that I was able to do that. And it also, the advantage of that was it gave me something to go back to my previous point about being able to take something away So I had something I could take with me. It wasn't just like I looked at a manuscript and said, wow, I don't know how exactly to approach this, and I will go home and I will not have any access to anything. But if I could make a copy of that on a flash drive and take it away with me, then I could just sit down and look at it later and make some decisions about what I wanted to do with it.
Can you just share, while you were going through this, what was the sense of the significance of the Book of Oberon, both magically and historically? And as you mentioned, there's the influence of Shakespeare. Like, why is this such an important text?
I'd say it's an important text for a few different reasons, one of which is the graphic element. There are actual pictures of spirits in it, even if we later learned that they were copied from another work or other works, and that was a little less special because you kind of wanted these to be, someone just sitting there in the circle and sketching in the picture, whatever they were looking at it, outside the circle for their own benefit. That would have been nice, but it didn't turn out to be the case. But it is a very striking aspect of it. I'd also say that it's a very good compilation of all the sorts of material out there. And, I have been already looking at some of the other magical miscellanies that have been published. Even at that time, there were much fewer back then. I was keeping an eye on those sort of things, and I said, you know what, this is something that's in a completely other class in terms of just the sheer amount of material that it covers, the diversity of the material that it covers, and this is really something that would probably be worth bringing to a broader readership.
Where does this fall in terms of the kind of timeline of English magic? Like people think, of course, of John Dee. People think of, Robert Turner making translations. People think of the mysteries of magic that was presented in the Victorian era. Like, what do you want listeners to know in terms of where it falls historically and its importance?
This text, we do have two dates in it, one of which is 1577 and the other one of which is 1583. So there's material before that, material after that. So you have to ask, okay, so how far back does that go and how far forward does it go? But this was really at a point when most of the magical material that was available, that wasn't coming in from, say, Agrippan Latin, was circulating in manuscript. There was, in terms of the translations of material like the 3 books and the 4th book and the Heptameron and all that sort of material, that only happened in the mid-17th century when I believe the factor was that the English Civil War was going on and there were a lot fewer sort of restrictions on the press. So it was possible for people to say, well, we're going to go out and we're going to publish, a translation of this Book of Magic. That's what Robert Turner did. There was nobody from the authorities who could come in and say, you probably shouldn't be doing this, because they were more worried about, the course of the war. There's like this little sort of tiny period of maybe a decade or two in British history where people could actually publish works of that sort. I would also say that this is slightly before Reginald Scott's discovery of witchcraft. So there's not a lot of published works on the topic for anyone. And so what this is a really good exemplar of the sort of book that was circulating at the time, which is a manuscript where somebody goes in and they're circulating it maybe among their friends, a group of manuscripts, and they write down what they like, and then they send it on to somebody else, and they compile their own personal work of magic that's collected from a number of different sources. It's hard to get into what exactly is the influence of the Book of Oberon, because the Book of Oberon, as a book created through that process, really is a bunch of different components. And you could talk about the influence of particular components sometimes, but that doesn't necessarily tie it back to the physical manuscript. The physical manuscript becomes more significant in the 19th century when it comes into the possession of George Graham, who we're going to talk about a little bit later, and Raphael, the first Raphael, Robert Cross Smith, who starts incorporating some material from that into the astrologer of the 19th century. At that point, it starts to inform sort of the discussion on magic. One of the things that I also want to make clear is I'm not sure where exactly that particular discussion and influence really manifested, because the later Victorian magic was really going to go in a very different direction. It very much more of a sort of creation of an overarching model of the cosmos. Also, the sort of privileging of particular texts like the Goetia, like a particular version of the Key of Solomon, like the Sacred Book of Abramelin the Mage. And it was really good, in terms of the work that was done on those books. I have a lot of respect for Mathers and Crowley and Waite and people like that. But it also sort of crystallized this sort of idea of, okay, this is what magic from, medieval and Renaissance times was. It's just like these works right here. It's only recently that people have started to say, well, there's some other material out there. Now, I'm not going to say that there was no awareness of this material because there were some works that were published, like the Treatise on Angel Magic. But it's only recently that people started to realize, oh, wait, this was what we knew and what everybody was focused on, and what Western esotericism surrounding ritual magic has been focused on for so long is really this really small subset of the texts that were actually created at the time. There's a broad, array of material out there. So I think in a sense, or in a lot of ways, the legacy of the Book of Oberon is in the future. At least I hope so. Because now this is material that was intended for private use. It was kept by private collectors. It was, maintained in the library until recently. And this is not a dig on the Folger Shakespeare Library in any sense. It's just kind of the nature of libraries. Until the digital revolution, not a lot of people really knew that it was there. And now it's a book that everyone can, that's available. People can go out, they can buy it, they can read it for themselves, and, in a way that doesn't require people to know Latin or require them to know how to read 16th century handwriting, which is actually, to be clear, it's not that bad. It doesn't take that long on that particular front. But now that's available and people can read it and they can make whatever calls they want to do about how they want to integrate that into their practice or how they want to explore the scholarly ramifications themselves.
As you mentioned, this came at a very precarious time historically. In the introduction to the book, it's mentioned that, there was John Dee, who was the shining exemplar, who made contributions to magic and mathematics and navigation. But you also mentioned, quote, this diversity of views did not always come with safety, however. England was embroiled in religious turmoil following the decision of King Henry VIII to abolish English Catholicism and set himself up as the head of the country's church. And a lot of this book kind of has these, very deep kind of Catholic overtones, I guess, and undertones to them. Can you just kind of share about, I guess, how magic was viewed in England at the time in terms of being forbidden, and then also this kind of very interesting Catholicism interweaving with the, brand new Protestant historical tributaries at the time?
How magic was viewed. Let's confine that more sort of the ritual magic side. It was looked at with disfavor by the government in particular circumstances. So if you were, I'm thinking about the Witchcraft Acts passed by Elizabeth and also by John I. They were really focused on, magic that was being used to harm people or magic that was used to find treasure, which it was basically taking money away from the crown. If you did these things, there could be very serious penalties. So there was that aspect of it. On some level, there was an understanding that these practices went on, and so long as you didn't cross the line or you didn't let people know you were crossing the line, it was okay to collect, manuscripts of magic. There was actually no law against having a manuscript of magic. It was just in the actual practice where people ran into some sort of trouble. So it just kind of went on under the surface. I believe the universities were great centers for that sort of thing, and sort of in terms of manuscript production and copying, even though it might have not have been what the libraries wanted to officially, highlight in their collections. It worked. These manuscripts worked their way in there. Of course, with the dissolution of the monasteries, you suddenly had a good number of people who had at one time had some sort of clerical training and had some, knowledge of a number of different topics, which could include magic, were now sort of set free, not by their own choice, but now they had to figure out how to make their way in the world. So some of them turned to magic as a way to sort of maintain themselves. I'm ambivalent about John Dee. Not because John Dee was not a bright guy, not because John Dee did not do amazing work, but because we tend to focus on John Dee as this is what everybody was like, in terms of when they practiced magic. And he's like sort of the Jimi Hendrix of magic in the sense that he's just going off, he's doing all this improv, or in terms of jazz. He just kind of started out with where everybody else did, and then he just started talking to spirits. He started building up his own system to an extent which I don't think a lot of people did. But a lot of people said, okay, well, I've got this system. I've got this particular working. I'm going to work this spell, and I'm going to see where that goes. And they didn't ordinarily keep the same sort of really detailed spiritual diaries that he did. There is an exception, which is, I think, the spiritual diary of Humphrey Gilbert and John Davis, who are two explorers, which I believe is going to be published at some point soon, but I don't think that's my place to announce that. It's not something I'm putting out myself. So I think that's what's good to understand is that, yeah, people were not really, they frowned upon magic, but it was not something they were interested necessarily in persecuting. But of course, they were more interested in making sure that the Catholics were not going to come into the country or come back into the country and, stir up trouble. That's where they really there was a lot of oppression and difficulty for those people there.
One of the most interesting things, Daniel, to me about the Book of Oberon, there's so many things, but one of is really how it kind of elaborates on previous grimoires. One of my interest areas is the Heptameron, and I remember reading a section in the Book of Oberon where it kind of extrapolates and expands on what's only hinted at in the Heptameron. So there's sections of, calling the angels by the four directions and expanding on prayers. Does it seem to you as a researcher that this was, as you mentioned, kept in private collections and for private use, that it was used by magicians who were kind of working through it and maybe adding on a little of that improv and a little bit of that jazz, so to speak, based on personal experience? Or do you think that it was something that might have just been added on by, say, a scholar or a translator who maybe didn't practice directly, but they thought that something made logical sense?
This is the huge question that I'm always grappling with, which is, okay, so I've got this manuscript. Is this written by somebody who is just interested in the topic? Or is it by someone who is interested in exploring that system through praxis? And I usually don't have a great answer for those questions because I think I won't get too much into what's already in the introduction to the Book of Oberon. There's parts of it where I say, yeah, I think this particular part indicates there might be some sort of practice going on. On the other hand, there's some parts where I say, well, I'm not really sure about that. It's really difficult. I mean, there's some cases in which you can find little marginal notes or annotations just kind of indicate there was some sort of practice. For example, you'll find a lot of treasure hunting sort of operations in these books. And a lot of times it's just saying, well, the spirits need to leave this particular ground. And with the new manuscript I'm just working on, which I will talk about in the patron section, I found that there was actually a place name inserted in. And that's sort of an indication, right? So it's like, okay, so you're actually thinking about using this and using that at a particular place. So that sort of pushes us more into away from curiosity and more into the spiritual practice category. I often have to wonder about this, but it's something I often keep in mind as I'm looking at these works in terms of trying to suss out whether, which way the author was going on this. And a lot of cases you're not going to find it out because they're not keeping a record of what they're actually doing. They've got a book that describes the operations, but as I said, they don't keep the same notes that John Dee was keeping about, on such and such a day, I did such and such an operation. This was the result. Under those circumstances, it's difficult to tell. I mean, you can think about it in analogy to today. I mean, for your listeners, look at your occult library and tell me how much of that you actually use in practice. And if you're using a lot of it, that is really impressive, or you have a really small library. We tend to accumulate these works. We may be using a few of them.
No, that's actually a really good point, because there's so much information out there. How much of that is, of all the tomes on someone's bookshelf, I think is what you're saying, Daniel. Like, how much is of that total pie of information? What slice of that is actually used by practitioners of Solomonic or Grimoire magic on a actual consistent basis?
And if you take that further back in time and you just apply the same analogy to these manuscripts we're finding, then you could probably say, well, yeah, maybe if it's the same percentage, which it may or may not be, let's face it, that may give us some idea of, what we can actually expect out of these manuscripts and what we can expect from the readers. I mean, if you take a look at something like Oberon, and you just take a look at the sheer amount of material in it, somebody cared a lot. I would hate to think that the person was just copying down material just sheerly because, for no good reason whatsoever. It's just that they were kind of curious. I think that Oberon goes a bit beyond what I think people would be, mere level of curiosity would cause them to produce. But of course, a lot of this gets back into questions about scribal culture and how much people actually were copying at the time, which is something that I still need to explore.
And to that point, Daniel, we have a few questions from listeners. One of them is from Frater Julianus, who is asking, the main thing I'd like to hear is accounts from people who have performed the operations described in the book. And to that point, Zach Phoenix is asking, I know people really don't like UPG, or unverified personal gnosis, but I love hearing it, and I wish we'd hear people talk about their actual lived experiences with this stuff a bit more than they currently do. To that point, Daniel, do you know anyone who has attempted this, or have you come across in your research, as you mentioned, an actual confirmed case of, someone has actually practiced this and recorded it and left a record? I don't know if you can comment to Frater Julianus or Zach's questions, but I leave it to you.
If people are practicing this, they are not writing me, and I am not seeking them out in order to figure out what's going on. I don't really get on a lot of the major occult forums. And I'll tell you, just to give some explanation of why that is, it's because one of the things I've learned, even when I was looking at, some of the Cthulhu material I started out with, and coming back to these manuscripts that I'm looking at now, is that so much of what you know about these topics as, a casual reader, which is, of course, how we all start out, doesn't really help you. I don't want to diminish the importance of having people practice this and the insights they can bring to it. But at the same time, a lot of times it comes with a bunch of other baggage. And one of the things I do is I kind of try to keep my head clear of the baggage. That means that I'm sitting there saying, okay, well, because a lot of what people practice with is sort of an amalgam. And a lot of it comes from, 19th and 20th century sources. And then they use that as kind of their background for what they're working with. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily give you inherent insight of what the copyists of these manuscripts were believing and what they were doing. Part of that process, unfortunately, requires that I spend minimal amounts of time looking to what modern magicians are doing. It's not, and if people, sometimes they come to talk to me and I talk back, it's often very interesting. It keeps me away from getting into what that praxis is in a lot of cases. I can say this, that I believe that Gordon White was teaching a class for ritual magic, and he used the Invocation of Berto, which is one of my personal favorites just because it's got a dragon in it. It's a very short, sort of concise little operation, and he used it for his class. And I heard about this from a couple of people who were going through the class, and they wanted to know, hey, there's a white-handled knife in this operation instead of a black-handled knife. Is that a blind? I'm like, yeah, there's a lot of white-handled knives out there. So in these magical manuscripts, so I wouldn't worry about that. I don't know how that went. I would be intrigued to know about it. I feel that it's out there, it's being used, but it's not something that I'm personally cognizant of.
To that point, Daniel, we do have a question from Adam J. Pearson, who's asking, quote, we know that the Book of Oberon calls for the use of the Seal of Solomon and references the Arbatel, the Heptameron, and the Sefer Raziel HaMalek. This places it in a lineage of influence stemming from these earlier texts. I wonder if Daniel would care to share how he sees the impact of the Book of Oberon on the grimoires that came after it? What contributions, if any, did the Book of Oberon make to the magical tradition that were carried forward in the grimoires that followed it? Or, differently stated, what should we interpret as being the legacy of the Book of Oberon?
Well, I refer you to my earlier comment about how I think most of the legacy of the Book of Oberon is probably to come, because it's one text and it's part of this broader sort of tradition of magical miscellanies, which we have been ignoring up until, very recently for the most part. People were really concentrating on, the Key of Solomon and the Goetia and things like that, which are sort of more like the sort of self-contained systems that don't include weird little rites where you just go out to the graveyard and you take some dirt and you say a prayer and you put it on your head and then you sleep and then you have a dream vision. I think that a lot of that material has been somewhat put aside in favor of those other texts. They were very influential at the time. This was very much sort of the stock in trade of what people were doing out in the country, and these cunning folk, but not necessarily something that really, the coming of print really changed the whole dynamic. So if something wasn't in print, people tended to pay less attention to it. In fact, one of the difficulties that people had at about the time, during the 16th and 17th centuries, was there was a lot of material coming into print. So people would often say, well, and there was a sort of prestige associated with that. So if you had a manuscript of a work that you had in print, a lot of libraries at the time might say, well, I don't think we need to have this manuscript. Let's just get rid of that. And with that sort of prestige that comes associated with print, there was a lot of pushing aside a lot of this material. And then, of course, you also had the rise of scientific rationalism, which also sort of marginalized it. I think that a lot of the miscellaneous, these short rites, really didn't have an opportunity to be all that influential, except for that little fluorescence in the early 19th century with Raphael, where he was taking this material and publishing it in the Astrologer of the 19th century and other publications. But I think that really, we will be seeing more of this creep into praxis as people start they read these books as they actually say, there's another way to approach the broader questions of magic and how it's practiced and what we were doing up until recently. And so let's explore that more.
Speaking of that kind of legacy and significance, Daniel, there's a question from Christopher Bailey, who's asking, Tritemius mentions this list of spirits and experiments, and I'm curious if Daniel can indicate any substantive differences between this book and derivative texts, not just in the spirits listed, but in differences in operations.
I'll talk about the question, this is one of those questions that is practically a research project on its own. And so I try to dodge these questions as much as possible because I have my own research projects I want to work on. So my response is, that sounds really interesting. I would suggest definitely looking into it, which is a complete dodge. I realize this. We talked about that question beforehand, and I kind of looked at it. I was like, sometimes you realize that you're going to get into something and you're going to dive in and you're not going to come up for a while. And I saw that question. I said, that's the case. And I said, okay, I've got several other projects I'm trying to work on right now. I don't want to really start a new one on top of them. I think these are definitely questions that we can examine. And this is the reason why I think that putting out a book like the Book of Oberon or my new book of Angels, Demons, and Spirits is important, because then it allows people to ask these questions and give a stab at trying to answer them themselves and to have these sort of conversations, which wouldn't happen otherwise.
That makes total sense, Daniel, and I think the listeners will appreciate that in terms of exactly. There's so many other projects that are happening as well, but it kind of opens up doorways where if you, as a reader, want to take things in a specific direction, have at it. The adventure awaits for you. And there was another question too, Daniel, about the Book of Oberon from Billy Ashford Webb, who's saying the presence of fairies in grimoires is something that Daniel has written about previously and is something that those practicing magic in the Anglo-speaking world have somewhat ignored for the most part until this work brought more attention to it. Perhaps Daniel could elucidate on some of the ambiguities and similarities between demonic and fairy spirits within literary ritual magic, and then in comparison with folk magic.
Okay, so I have a few comments on this particular front, which is good because I just wrote an article about this about a year ago. So first of all, I just want to give some credit to David Rankin, who has been publishing material that deals with fairy magic for some time before now. So because people sometimes point at Oberon as the starting point, but I think he's actually the starting point in this particular era for these sort of rituals. People are often, who wrote these manuscripts, were often very cagey about what exactly it was they were calling up. The most common word is spirit, because once again, if you look at, and not to say that the law was necessarily guiding what people were thinking as they were transcribing these manuscripts, it probably was to some extent, but it was also, social pressure and things of that sort that were probably factors. People didn't like saying that a spirit was a demon. Because obviously, well, that's an evil spirit. You shouldn't be dealing with evil spirits. We're going to do horrible things to you now, say the authorities. So they would often just use the term spirit. So you just get, we don't know who this guy is. He's just a spirit. Oh yeah, his name's Satan. Just a spirit. Don't worry about that. So it's often hard to sort of separate out what category some of these beings fall into. But I did take a stab at this in an article at differentiating between demons and fairies, or what you might call the broader category of spirits, which are, from our modern perspective, we would consider mostly demonic. There are a few different traits that seem to come through, one of which is, I think there's more of an emphasis on individual, very small rites. Now, you don't get these lengthy procedures for the most part for the fairies. They're often incorporate more folk magic, and I think this is one of those areas where it's hard to draw a clear differentiation, because I think that there's definitely some adaptation of folkloric material in there, such as the importance of an ointment that you put in your eyes to be able to see spirits, that you see a great deal with fairy rites. And just as a warning, everybody, I do not recommend doing magic which requires you to put like animal fat in your eyes and stuff like that. That just doesn't sound like a good idea. But that's something that's a major motif in the folklore about dealing with, these beings that live in our world, but that are not necessarily human. And that makes its way into the grimoires. There's also kind of an emphasis on food and drink. One of the things I've been looking at and wrote an article about in an anthology called The Fairy Queens, which I don't think it's from Avalonia. I don't think people really know too much about this particular work, but it was an examination of how people would often set up a table and chairs and lay out food, not just in like hey, we're going to leave out some, a dish of cream for the brownies or something like that. This was really trying to lay out a very impressive meal for these supernatural beings. And so there's an interesting emphasis on the food and drink and treating these things as if they are entities on the level of humans who should be approached differently. Now, having said this is not always the case, and there are a lot of mashups. There's a lot of tension between what I would see as sort of the more folk way of treating with these beings and the ritual magic way of treating with these beings, which kind of come together in the manuscripts in odd ways. For example, there's the sort of ritual with providing the spirits with food and drink is something that's mentioned in the fourth book of Occult Philosophy. They lay out the ritual and then they say, well, you could sit at the table, but maybe you should draw a magic circle around yourself. So you're still sitting at the table with the spirits, but you got a magic circle around yourself. And I think most people would say, well, that kind of seems pointless because it looks like you've just kind of broken your own magic circle. There's a tension there of people trying to adapt these practices and yet say, well, we still got to do, the usual ceremonial or ritual magic sort of practice where we, keep ourselves apart from the spirits and all that. It's like the rite in Discovery of Witchcraft for summoning the fairy Sibylla, where she's in a circle 4 feet away, and then you're saying, hey, we're going to end this by having sex. And it's like, okay, so at some point, the magic circle becomes less important in this operation because that's not going to work otherwise. So there were a lot of attempts to, I think, to sort of incorporate them in and respect sort of folk traditions that were out there and recognize their role. But at the same time, to try to shoehorn them into this other model, which is not necessarily always compatible. And the one entity where this becomes most important in terms of this sort of syncretism is Oberon, because Oberon, for the most part, is summoned using language and procedures that are almost entirely like you were calling up, say, another spirit of a demonic nature. There are some little caveats there. Like one of the things that some of the rites do is you go and talk to his ministers. So whereas in a regular ritual magic procedure, you'd be talking, you'd start out with talking about God, and then you start moving out to the saints, and maybe you bring in some of the kings of the four directions or something like that, and then you move down to him, and that's certainly in some of the Oberon rituals. But there's also this other part where you're moving up through the ministers and saying, hey, can you get me in with your boss? Or less by questioning them and more by ordering them. But it's still sort of working your way back up the hierarchy, which is interesting. These are rituals which have a special fascination for me, and I've really been spending some time looking into them. And I think at this point I probably have tracked down about, I want to say, maybe 80 of them that I think are worthy of further examination. I'm trying to figure out what exactly I want to do with this particular information. But I'm hopeful that this will be of broader interest. I'm glad that question was asked, because that means there may be a market for this and people will be interested in hearing more.
To that point, reading specific passages of the Book of Oberon, you'll have passages where there's an entire section, like the entire exorcism of the spirits of the air, the longest section in Latin from the Heptameron of Peter de Abano, is put in the Book of Oberon, but right before that, there's an insertion in the exorcism itself, or in the conjuration itself, to either the four kings or to higher beings that's not present in the Heptameron. So it does seem like whoever was working this or compiling this added sections or found a section that was very, very similar to the Heptameron, but used this kind of stratification of either kings of the four directions or beings like, Satan and Lucifer. Like, that is really fascinating in terms of developing that specific architecture.
Yeah, and I think that what my new book of Angels, Demons, and Spirits brings home is that there were actually people out there who were looking at magic just in that sense. And there was a lot of examination of that, because of Angels, Demons, and Spirits is often just a compilation of different material where you can see they took like little bits from here and there. It's like, okay, we really like this magic circle. Let's take that. And oh yeah, we need to have a dismissal for Ascario. We'll just take one. And they kind of combine them together in their book. So I guess my particular take would be that this was probably one of the books in a particular person's library, and they were using other books, and they were kind of cobbling together their own system so that they could have something that would work in particular for them, or would work with their sensibilities, or would just make sure that if ceremony A has some sort of flaw in it, then I've got ceremony B as a backup.
We had a question from Matatias Ephraim, who is asking, on the 89th page of the Book of Oberon, there is a reference to the 7 Sabbath orations. Can you, Daniel, share a little bit about what are the 7 Sabbath orations?
Not offhand, no. This is the great thing about this, and once again, this is why I wanted to publish this book, because people look at things and they read them and they say, okay, well, what does this mean, Dan? I'm like, I don't know. I mean, this person has probably been dead for 400 years. It makes things dealing with your editors a lot easier, too, because it's just like, they're like, well, what does this mean? I'm like, I can't really go talk to that person, But I think that this is the sort of question that this book was intended to inspire. I will see what I can find out about that. I appreciate the question nonetheless, even if I cannot answer it. And sometimes I feel like I do get questions like this, and I have to just say I don't know, because it's a lot of material to cover, and sometimes someone looks at a text and they see something different than what you do, and that's part of what makes this so rewarding. It's like, okay, well, oh gee, I didn't realize I did that. Like, one example from Oberon is we've got a copy of the Emerald Tablet in this book, and in the course of, just going through and, editing the text and modernizing the language and looking over the proofs, it just kind of slipped past. And I said, well, and later I looked at it, I was like, oh, gee, we have that in there. We probably should have said something about that, but we didn't. But that will be a matter of interest. If people are interested in, sort of the alchemical influence, well, there's something in there. I wish I'd actually figured out where that was before I started talking about that, because, I would love to give people a page reference, but it's in there. It's in there.
As well, Daniel, we had, just kind of buttoning up the Book of Oberon focus, we have another question from a Heimdall Vale, and a Heimdall is asking, I'd love to hear more about the individual called Friar Bacon and their relationship to the manuscript authors. I'd also love to hear more about corrections in the illustrations made from the original drawings, and any perspective that you have, Daniel, on how the ecclesiastical authors would have viewed Satan as an entity, whether a trickster spirit or a Christian adversary.
Well, let's go through them. Let's start out with Friar Bacon. So, of course, I think when we're talking about Friar Bacon, we have to go back to Roger Bacon and his reputation as a necromancer. And I think that what we see in these particular manuscripts is a sort of an adaptation of him, but he usually doesn't appear with the name Roger. We see this friar named William Bacon show up. And he shows up, I think, a couple of times in Oberon. And there's one point where it's said that he's helping a group of magicians. And this is the passage which I thought everyone was going to go absolutely crazy about and start, talking to everyone about, but everyone seems to just ignore it. But there's talk about a clerk who is working with an international group of magicians, some of them who are in England and some of them who are in France, and working at cathedral schools. This Friar Bacon seems to be helping all of them out with their whatever it is they're doing with their magical operations. My take is that probably I've kind of fall on the side of Friar Bacon, William Bacon, just being this non-historical figure. Now, that is just, I have to say that's more of a feeling. I actually read an article recently in which someone was actually quoting from Oberon. They said, this could actually be an historic person. And, it's possible that William Bacon is a historic person that I've just kind of missed in terms of looking for, trying to find out more about. It's kind of an open question about who this person is and, what exactly their influence was. Okay, second question about the corrections in the illustrations. These books were written by people who, if you read the introduction to the Book of Oberon, they were not always careful about how they presented materials. There's a lot of mistakes in the Latin and things like that, which someone who is educated could have easily corrected. So it sounds like they were more interested in possibly just writing down things quickly than they were in making sure that everything was accurate. So with these books, we fortunately have James Clark, who can help us by redrawing the illustrations. And I think I could say we try to go for the highest level of authenticity and replication with those illustrations. I would say that Of Angels, Demons, and Spirits is going to take that up a notch, because I decided one of the unfortunate side effects of working with Joe Peterson is he raises your standards amazingly. He and I really got into it over Of Angels, Demons, and Spirits, saying, okay, well, I'm like, yeah, I see what you're doing here, but I think you need another stroke right in the middle, or maybe we need to change the proportions on this one. And I felt sort of bad about it, because oh my gosh, this guy, because James is a great person to work with, but I was like, oh my gosh, I'm being so much harder on him, I feel like, than I was with Oberon. But then at the end, he came to me and said, I'm really glad you care this much. And I was like, oh, thank goodness. That was a really great experience. And it's a little bit trickier with the new book than with Oberon, because Oberon I was more willing to sort of just say, okay, well, we're all kind of looking at it, but we're not really getting into doubling down to the specifics. And we do the best we can. You kind of have to make judgment calls sometimes. So, if you have a circle, it's more of an oval. Okay, so do we assume that they really wanted to draw a circle and we're just bad at it? That's probably a safe assumption. Okay, so what do you do if there's a flaw in the wording? Maybe you look at another manuscript and that they use different wording, and you can tell that they just made a mistake, like they got Gabriel's name wrong. Well, yeah, let's make a note of that, and let's put that in the footnotes. It is a judgment call. I think the nice thing about Oberon is that the Folger Shakespeare Library is wonderful, and it's put all of these online. So if you have a question about whether a particular rendering is accurate, you can always go and look at their website, and you can compare our manuscript to that, and you can just make sure that that's, if that is something if absolute fidelity is a concern for you. But I will also say that with regard to the people who are writing these manuscripts, I'm not sure how much absolute fidelity was a concern for them. Sometimes they were just clearly writing down something very quickly, and even though, these are the sort of things that you think that people were supposed to get right, and they would be very fastidious about it. Sometimes they're not. Being aware that might have been their attitude as well might help people when they're approaching these, in terms of their own practice.
Heimdall Vale is also asking if there's any perspective you can share on how the ecclesiastical authors would have viewed Satan as an entity, whether a trickster spirit or a Christian adversary.
So when he says ecclesiastical authors, I would wonder what exactly he was meaning. I mean, because these surviving writings by the ecclesiastical writers, had the dominant sort of cultural perspective at the time, you get a sense that he's really, this very, he's the great deceiver, and he's the adversary and all this other material. When you look at the grimoires, I hesitate to get too much into what Satan is in the grimoires, because I think that I haven't really sat down to form a comprehensive picture of Satan, or my feeling is that it probably wouldn't reveal that much anyway. I don't think that people had this idea of who Satan was. If you even look at the spirit list, Satan's number 3 on that list. So that's a little bit of a difference. I think the folkloric element does tend to come in more in the conjurations, because you are trying to convince Satan or any of these other spirits, these demonic spirits, that they should appear in a particular form in a particular way. Just as an aside, we were talking about fairy magic earlier. That occurs less in the fairy magic procedures. Even though fairies, as we know, are even at that time associated with trickery and illusion, there's much more of a attitude of, okay, we're just going to do it right for the fairies, and fairies will show up. Whereas if you're dealing with these other entities, there's a lot of emphasis on, okay, so you're going to show up, you're going to be in a fair and pleasing form, you're going to look like a 3-year-old kid. I don't know why they need to look like a 3-year-old kid. I guess it's something that's relatively harmless. Or they're going to look like a monk or something like that. They're not going to smell bad, and they're going to come and they're going to tell you the truth. So there is sort of this understanding that, these spirits are deceivers, and they're going to try to trick you, but then you can kind of get around that if you just use the right words and you're paying attention to what's going on, and if you've done what you're supposed to be doing. There are some grimoires in the French and German traditions where there's more of an emphasis on the magician fooling the spirit, and that's something like, I'm thinking about the Crime Grimoire or some of the Faustian materials, where you're kind of tricking the spirit yourself into doing things instead of just commanding him. And I don't see that a lot in the English manuscripts. But there is sort of that engagement with the idea that these spirits are tricksters, and that a cunning person and a clever person and a person who has faith and uses the right words can overcome that.
There's also a question, Daniel, from Thomas Edward Starkey, who mentions, I'd like to hear about how people have worked or approached Berto, one of your favorites, or even Lady Sibylla.
Not in terms of what people have written me about. And just to be clear, if you have worked with them, and you have had experiences with them, I have no qualms about getting emails from you telling me all about it. Because that is part of what I do, and that often helps to inform the sort of things I'm doing. I may not go engage with your particular framework, because people like to alter the framework and say, well, I don't know about this part, I don't know about that part, that doesn't meet with me. And if you're clear about what you're doing there, that's valuable to me, because then I can say, okay, well, they weren't quite doing it in the same way that someone from maybe the 16th century would do it. But knowing that can often, it's another level of engaging with the text. It's another level of sort of understanding it, which I think is valuable. So please feel free to send those on if you have tried some of these rites, and let me know how they go.
I think, Daniel, this would be a great time to discuss one of your other works that you mentioned, which is Of Angels, Demons, and Spirits, a Sourcebook of British Magic. Can you give us kind of the background of this book, and especially I remember when Joseph Peterson was on the podcast talking about his presentation of the Ars Rabidmidar, The Secrets of Solomon, talking about how that work was pretty much a bridge between, what people perceive as ceremonial magic and what people perceive as cunning man or village magic. But can you share about your source book of British magic that you presented? Why is this so significant?
It's significant because it's a very sort of comprehensive treatise. It's not as long as Oberon, but it's also very much on point in terms of what it presents. It's somebody who knows what they're looking for, who's finding interesting incantations and diagrams and things of that sort. And they're kind of putting together this very sort of compact, easy to read, beautiful little book, and one that I perceive as being more toward that cunning folk end of things. If you said that, if you're talking about this, this spectrum, which is sort of a false dichotomy anyway, but someone who is interested in doing some healing in the local village, or who is interested in maybe warding off witchcraft or finding treasure, or, doing the things that are the common stock of the cunning folk. That being said, if people say, well, I want to find, something about, spirit summoning more, I want to learn more about that sort of aspect of things, this book is very good because it presents a book of consecrations for dealing with spirits. It is similar to material in the Goetia, like where you talk about, okay, well, you summon dukes at such and such an hour and counts at such and such an hour. But the material in there is different than what's in the Goetia. So it's giving different hours. It's talking about other aspects of summoning, where to do it, how to specialize with particular spirits and how they might have particular needs. And it also has lists of spirits that are not the same as the one in the Book of Oberon and are in fact entirely different. Because I think one of the things about the list of spirits in the Book of Oberon, which has gotten a lot of attention from Jake Stratton-Kent and others, and I think rightly so, because it sort of expands on what that list in the Goetia does, even though there are differences. I'm not going to say that one is the same as the other. But I think we're still very focused on the Goetia as our way of understanding spirit lists, in terms of, okay, well, the Book of Oberon just kind of gives us this additional material which we tack on to this idea of the spirit list. But spirit lists were actually quite prevalent in these books, and they are not necessarily all of the same model. And the spirit lists that are in this new book are completely different. They're coming from a completely different place. They're not even a riff off that Goetia. They're something entirely different. They've got different characters, they've got different focuses, and they've got a completely different sort of collection of spiritual beings that they focus on.
Is it, in your mind as a researcher and as a scholar, is it an artificial distinction? Is it a false dichotomy to kind of present things as, something is just, cunning man or village magic, or something is just ceremonial magic? Or is there some kind of flexibility and just kind of malleability when it comes to like a source book of British magic?
Just to be clear, when I'm talking about this being what I consider more of a cunning persons or cunning folk grimoire sort of piece, it's because I took a look at what Owen Davies defines in his book Popular Magic in terms of what were the domains of the cunning folk, and I brought it back to this book. I think that breaking it down, there could be some that it works out there that are more toward that sort of model. In fact, I can tell you that The Long Lost Friend, I would say, is very much of that model. It's really aimed at, well, not necessarily at somebody who may be practicing in for their particular village, but it's sort of like, okay, you're out here in the Pennsylvania wilderness. What are you going to do when, your animals get sick, or you think there's been a hex placed on you, or you need to make glue or beer or even something like that. So I'd say that's really very, if someone said that is more in terms of a cunning folk grimoire, you could, of course, debate whether the term cunning folk is how great the term is for that particular Merlot. That really does fall in that. I think so that one I would be very confident saying, yeah, that's on that side of the spectrum. But a lot of the works of magic, whether we think about them in terms of, something like the Key of Solomon or either one of these books of mine, I would say they sort of have qualities of both. For example, Oberon, I'd say falls more on the ceremonial magic side of things because you've got these lengthy operations. There could be a lot of preparation. I think maybe I just thought of this, so this is something that's going to have to be vetted by other people, but maybe one of the signs of someone on that sort of ritual magic side is if you have a rite that doesn't really explain why you're summoning up that particular spirit, I would say maybe that's a little bit more on the, sort of learned ritual magic side, which because you do get that. I mean, you summon up the spirit Berto. Well, why do you do that? It doesn't say. What's so great about Berto? Why do you want to call him up? Whereas something on the cunning side is very particular about what it needs to accomplish. It's often shorter because you may not have a lot of time. If someone's bleeding out, you don't have a time to, go out and consecrate your tools and say some sort of, 15-minute incantation to be able to deal something with that. But a lot of these books do have elements of both, and both the Book of Oberon and of the Angels, Demons, and Spirits, they cover both of those bases. So it's clear that there's a lot of overlap there. And even something like, if you talk about something like the Key of Solomon, it usually has rituals in there for love or for, bringing about invisibility and things of that sort. In some cases, they seem just sort of tacked on in terms of the rest of the system. It's like, okay, but this doesn't really relate to everything else. So I think there's a broad spectrum here in terms of what people were interested in. And I think that it's interesting to be able to talk about that, and I hope there will be more conversations about that as we get more into these books and as we pay more attention to the text and try to figure out, why did these people write the text they did? Because it's still, to me, in many cases, very baffling, and I could see different parts of the book, and I'm like, so were they interested in, working with this big group of spirits, or were they interested in trying to scare off witches for the local people? And because you've got rites in there that do both. And so which were they doing both, or was it just one they were curious in and one of which they actually, were trying to practice? And if so, which one was the case? I think these are good research questions that should be explored more.
Can you share a little bit, Daniel, about Of Angels, Demons, and Spirits, a Sourcebook of British Magic, about how there's this fascinating introductory material that readers can enjoy that explores the genesis of the Bodleian Library at Oxford. And obviously you have a master's in, library sciences. Can you share a little bit about this introductory material? Because I think a lot of grimoires, I shouldn't say a lot, but many might not have that kind of historic introductory material. What's all this about?
A lot of it focuses on a person called Thomas Allen. And so Thomas Allen was a tutor at Oxford who actually gave up a formal position with the college, I believe. And we believe it was because he would have had to have become Protestant officially, whereas otherwise he could just if he was a tutor, people would pay less attention to him and he could kind of get by on the margins. I want us to be able to say that while this book, it's pretty clear this book was something that was on the scene in Oxford for quite some time. It's not absolutely certain that Thomas Allen owned it, because our source for that is a recollection from a later librarian after his death, that it came from his collection. And it really depends on something which I don't know, which is how reliable that particular librarian was and how much that person would have been able to say, oh yeah, this particular book of magic definitely came from Thomas Allen, or it just had some vague memory. Oh yeah, he had this book, it had magic circles in it. This book has magic circles in it, so it probably came from Thomas Allen. But Thomas Allen is a fascinating figure. Thomas Allen, in addition to what we just talked about, it would sound as if he's a marginal figure on the campus. But in fact, he was very involved in its life. He knew a lot about traditions. He was invited to all the best campus parties. He came into contact with the Duke of Leicester, and the Duke of Leicester was an individual who was very much about rooting out the Catholic influence in England as a confidant of Queen Elizabeth. But apparently they got along really well. So he had the ear of powerful individuals, and he was also apparently a friend of John Dee. I mentioned in the book that there's sort of this interesting tie there, because Albert Lasky, the nobleman who eventually convinced John Dee to come with him to Europe, and probably that was probably not one of Dee's best decisions because Lasky turned out to be kind of a scoundrel. But Lasky, before he asked Dee to come to Europe, he asked Tom Allen to come to Europe. And so I don't think that John Dee was the second choice. I would hesitate to say that. It may have been he wanted both of them to come. It may have been that, he was going to, it was just a matter of timing and where he was at a particular time. He was actually someone who people had a lot of respect for. And he's just a fascinating individual. I would also like to point out at this point that the Skinner and Rankin's Cunning Man's Grimoire also probably passed through the collection of Tom Allen. Skinner and Rankin have slightly different views of Tom Allen than I do. They believe that he was probably a magician. They say he probably was. I'm not sure the evidence is there, but I can also see that how they're interpreting the evidence. And actually, I think I found a couple of other little tidbits about Thomas Allen, which actually strengthens their case. But he was definitely someone I would love to know more about, and who didn't really say a whole lot. I think the lesson that Thomas Allen teaches us is if you want people to remember you, make sure you're writing things down and getting them published. Because otherwise, he maybe had one sort of commentary on Ptolemy or something like that, which never really got a lot of traction and never was published, so nobody knows who he is. But he's definitely a fascinating figure.
Is there anything else that you'd like listeners to know about this specific tome that maybe we haven't covered, or are there's so many gems in it? But is there anything on the onset that you just like people to know? I am really very happy with this book. It has some incredible spiritual diagrams in it and talismans. Once again, James Clark's work is top notch. It does get a little bit more into some aspects of fairy magic. It has a short write to the spirit Benias, who was known from dealing with Dr. John Lamb. Dr. John Lamb was a sort of notorious cunning man who was eventually killed or seriously injured unto death by a London mob. And there are mentions in the pamphlets that he called up this spirit called Benias. Oh, we've got an incantation to Benias in the book. We've also got a couple of rites that are intended to the graveyard sort of dirt rites I was talking about earlier, which were very unusual. In this particular work, they are referred to a spirit called Sezel. In other works, that being is known as Azazel. Now we have this interesting, very familiar demonic name, which is turning up in these, this very concise ritual that's intended for someone to contact the dead and, through a necromantic rite. So they're just like it's a miscellany. So you find things like that in there and you say, well, that would definitely be something that's worth pursuing or that somebody might find that is meaningful to them. And it sort of takes us once again away from that model of ritual magic, which is, okay, well, you gotta have like half a dozen tools, which it's not, or even a dozen tools. It's not clear what all of them do. And you've got to go through all these preparations. But this is a very different sort of magic that people were also doing alongside these other treatises. And it's good to know about that. And it often reflects modern sensibilities more in a lot of cases, because I think a lot of people these days are into, sort of more the less complex rites that are sort of less about, calling down the wrath of the Almighty upon the spirit and having more of a conversational attitude towards them. I think this book will please a lot of people. You mentioned how awesome it is to work with Joseph H. Peterson and how he is just excellent in terms of always having the highest expectations. And also with James R. Clark, can you share about how it is to work with an illustrator like James and really that back and forth and that dynamic? Because whether it's yourself and James working or yourself and Joseph Peterson and James R. Clark working with the Book of Oberon, how does that dynamic work in terms of, let's say you come across a passage or you're translating something or you're looking at something, do you tell James, like, hey, this would be a great illustration? Does James come to you? And then does Joseph Peterson, like, how do you, do you all do giant, like, Skype chats? Like, how do you do this?
We actually, I don't know if I've ever Skype chat with James. I mean, it's usually not a question about whether something needs to be drawn. You look at the manuscript, you say, okay, we can't do that with text. And it's becoming a little bit more, one of the tricky parts about book creation is that the line between print and digital. And for example, it would be very difficult to create an ebook of Oberon because we use tables for so much of it. You've got so much of it, which is like, okay, here's the Latin text, here's the English translation. It's in a table, it's side by side. But if you try to take that over into an ebook, the whole thing falls apart. So for Of Angels, Demons, and Spirits, it became much more important. That the art becomes more important because sometimes the artist is also, you have to basically draw a table instead of just, I'm working on the illustrations. So we look at the manuscript and it's usually very clear. I have been putting little notes into the manuscript saying, okay, and usually it's just like diagram. And unfortunately, I don't know how frustrating this is for James because sometimes diagram is just like it's like we just need to draw like this little T in the text because it's like a non-standard font. It's just like a little magical seal that's a little bit off from a regular T, but we want to make sure that's accurate. And sometimes it's, this huge full page illustration. And so we go back and forth about, okay, there's usually not much of a question about whether something should be drawn. We get into how it should be drawn and how big it should be because, of course, people are drawing these at all sorts of different sizes, whereas it's easier to be able to say, okay, this is kind of an in-text illustration, or this should take a quarter of a page, or this should take half of a page, something along those lines. And then he puts together a PDF of each illustration from the manuscript. He just takes the original image and puts it in there. So we can start talking about these less in terms of diagram and more in terms of, okay, this is diagram 31. It's on such and such a page. And this is what it looks like. It should be about this big. And then we start the work from there in terms of figuring out what do we need to do with this. For example, as a contrast with Oberon, when you look at the microfilm rendered PDF for Of Angels, Demons, and Spirits, which is Emusio 173, it does not show up the red as well. It's not like you don't see red text, but if there's red in a particular illustration, it doesn't show up well. So there was a point where I just went, I don't actually think we had a conversation about that. I think this is actually a real learning experience for us, and I hope to work with him on future projects because I think we've got our method down now. So I looked at some of these and had to go back and look at the original and say, okay, because they're using red in it, we have to make sure that the red is actually rendered properly in those illustrations. So I had to take some more pictures. And once we get that done, he starts drawing the pictures and sending them in. And then I sit down, I look at them, and I'm like, okay, that's a pretty good look. Oh, wait, there's an error in the text. We got to fix that. And usually, 98% of the time it's fine. You want to make sure you're being conscientious about that and making sure that it's as accurate as possible. So he will put up with this. And I don't think I've actually heard him express frustration. We have gone back and forth about a few things, but it's more like, okay, I see where you're coming from, but I kind of want to go about it this way. Oh yeah, well, one of the things we sometimes talk about is, okay, do we want to, if you have an illustration that has a clear error in it, do you want to show the error? Do you want to show what it should be and make a note of that? I think there was one point where we even said, okay, for some of these, we may just want to have one with an error in the text and then maybe include one in the appendix. I don't think that actually got past the editors, but we'll see if that's more of a factor in the future and have another conversation about it. But yeah, that's what it's like. The nice thing about working with him, he's very quick about this. He could turn these around in an amazing amount of time. I think he kind of came in toward the end of the project on Angels, Demons, and Spirits. Not that we didn't know we were going to do it, but I was doing a lot more work with the text and, getting all the text in place, because if you don't know what the text is, it becomes much more difficult to draw the illustrations. And if you don't have an idea of what the handwriting is and, how it might compare to other manuscripts, that makes it more difficult. He is able to turn it around wonderfully. He's a professional, and it looks great. As everybody knows who's looked at these books.
I was just thinking, like you mentioned, he's never expressed frustration. I'm like, how many small T's or red coloring requests does it take for James R. Clarke to express frustration,
As I said, he just seems to be happy that I'm paying attention to the small details in the same way he is. I've been very happy with our collaboration. And just to be clear, I'm also really happy with Joe Peterson, so people don't think I'm damning him by not mentioning him. I have actually not had the gall to ask Joe for any sort of collaboration. In fact, I didn't ask him to collaborate on the Book of Oberon. I think we just sent him the PDF to get his impression. He's like, yeah, I could work on this with you guys. I'm like, okay, yeah, sure. Joe Peterson wants to work on a book. All right, yeah, sure. We'll go with that. What else are you going to say? I've had the pleasure of working with both of them, and they're really great people to work with. And I will also say, in Joe Peterson's favor, this is something I've noticed in recent scholarly articles, because I also keep up with the scholarly literature, of course. I'm not sure. I write scholarly articles, but I'm not. I may be falling more on the popular end of things sometimes, just in terms of like the sheer amount of writing texts that are intended for modern readers. But Joe is getting a lot of respect, even from, the people who are, there's sort of this idea where you've got these people, I won't name particular names, but they're scholars. They're working on what they're doing. They don't interact a whole lot with maybe a lot of some of the people who are creating text from our popular audiences, but they are citing Joe Peterson a lot. And just saying, yeah, we're really glad that Joe Peterson is out there. I'm like, yeah, I guess that's how much respect Joe has, is that he's able to command the same sort of respect and adulation that he's getting from people who are interested in these topics in a more casual way. He's getting the same attention from scholars these days, and that's just neat to see.
Speaking of that kind of diligence and scholarship and researching things, you wrote a fascinating book called Balloonists, Alchemists, and Astrologers of the 19th Century, The Tale of George and Margaret Graham, which the title alone almost begs itself to be some kind of like independent movie. Who are George and Margaret Graham? Can you tell us about this fascinating interweaving in the 19th century in England between balloonists, alchemists, and astrologers? And what inspired you to write this book?
The publication of this book is it's kind of a personal defeat for me, which sounds odd to say, but there was a plan. I was working with Caduceus Books to release a Key of Solomon reproduction that was commissioned for George Graham, I believe likely by Frederick Hockley. This is at the Cleveland Public Library. Another press has just put this out, and that's cool for them. It's a cool book. That's great. But then I was like, okay, well, so I've got an introduction that I was writing to this Key of Solomon, and now I don't know what to do with it. So I was like, okay, well, I'll just put this out as a book in itself, because the Grahams are just fascinating figures. I think George Graham was born in 1784. But he starts becoming prominent in the early 19th century, and then he marries Margaret. I don't have a precise date for that in front of me, but it's in the 1820s. They were mainly known as balloonists for going to various spots around the country and, going to a fair or going to a major event and then having, launching a balloon and get everyone excited about that. There were, crowds of thousands or tens of thousands who watched them go up. There were sometimes, very rowdy crowds who would riot if things didn't go the way what you wanted to. And this is what they've mainly been known for. They've also, to be very honest, been known for crashing a lot of balloons or having serious accidents, which did not prevent them from, having a lot of kids and living to ripe old ages. But so there you are. But at the same time, there's this other aspect of them where they were very much involved with the occult movements of the early 19th century. For example, when the first Raphael, Robert Cross Smith, came from Bristol to London and was trying to set up himself as an astrologer, the person who helped him out was George Graham and helped him was instrumental. And he actually, I believe, and I don't have the chronology in front of me, which is always a problem, but I believe that it was George Graham and Raphael who wrote their first book together. And then Raphael took off, and after some false starts, he finally got his almanac off the ground and became immensely successful. George and Margaret Graham were very much into astrology. It really sounds as if one of their side projects was they had a hat and glove shop. And I think they were trying to get along around the sort of laws against fortune telling. So what they did is they said, okay, hey, everybody, we got this hat and glove shop. You come in, you can buy a nice hat, you can buy some gloves, and you get a free astrological reading with that. So, of course, what you're really paying for is the astrological reading. That was their sort of way of circumventing, the law at the time. They were also into alchemy. I don't know if George ever set up a lab or Margaret ever set up a lab, but he was certainly pursuing people who he hoped would be able to do that, to help him out with that. We do have letters of this sort. There's, of course, that weird little Key of Solomon, which actually does not fit in with any other English tradition of the Key of Solomon at the time. A lot of people may be familiar with the Sibley Clavis. This is not that. This is something entirely different. And it's got a bunch of weird talismans made with, just bizarre things like tiger skin and duck's blood. And it's got instructions for capturing a tiger at night with nets in order to acquire its skin for the talisman. And I want to say this about Ben Fernie, who does a lot of excellent work, but there are lines Ben will not cross. Because I asked him about that. It's like, you can go out in the jungle and catch a tiger, which of course is illegal. We don't want to injure tigers. But there were a number of reasons he did not want to do that. So it's just this fascinating, weird little book. It's got this odd ceremony for summoning a spirit at a body of running water or something like that. I would say if you're looking for that particular book, keep your eye out for it. I think it's Ion Sophia Press that put it out. But anyway, let's get back to this particular book. So you got these people, and they're very, prominent public figures. They're known throughout, national media. They're getting a lot of coverage. But at the same time, they're just working on alchemy and, some astrology and then maybe some ritual magic at the same time, which makes them they're probably some of the most famous people who were occultists at the time, but people don't really know who they are or that they were involved in all this. What I did for this book is I sort of pieced this all together. So I went through the newspaper accounts of their various flights and covered those. But there's also some material at the Wellcome Institute and the Senate House Library at the University College of London, which is just letters and little scrapbooks and maybe like a business card they used to have and little satirical pieces that were poking fun at them. And you can use all of these to sort of build up this picture of this wonderfully eccentric yet successful couple. One of the unintended effects of this is that people read this book and they really like the Grahams. And that's difficult because, you would think that after writing a book, you really develop a sympathy for somebody and you understand, why they did what they were doing. At the same time, I kind of can't like the Grahams because really they needed to just inflate their balloons more because they were going around and they would leave the balloon slightly uninflated and then they'd just decide to go up and then would crash into a building. And at one point they actually killed somebody because they knocked off part of the building on them. Or they, injured themselves or all these things would happen. But the people who read this book have a very positive opinion. These people were brave. They were able to find ways to overcome all this adversity, all these, balloons that crashed and were torn and went off to sea and exploded. And they were able to get more balloons, and make them and put them up again. I think that they're really some very interesting people who have not received a lot of attention.
One of the things that really struck me about the book is ballooning in a sense when crowds would gather to watch a balloon take off. It reminded me for some weird reason about the Roman Colosseums. And if the crowd was not happy, if there was a delay in launch, if the launch went poorly, if the crowd was promised a launch or a balloon to ascend into the heavens and it didn't happen, they would get, as you mentioned, riotous, and things would get burned down, and there would be just people picking up weapons and fighting and trying to storm. And I'm like, wow, this is totally not what you would think ballooning is, especially when you see modern day pictures of, balloon festivals in Albuquerque or something,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was really like a public spectacle, and it was often something where, it could turn very violent very quickly, especially if people thought you were hoaxing them, having the balloon being announced and the set being announced and having everybody buy tickets, and that, which of course, people can see it from outside the area where the ticket holders are. And then the balloon doesn't go up and then people are unhappy. And that's another sort of, area for tension with me with the Grahams. It's okay, you guys knew at this point that maybe you wouldn't be able to bring up the balloon. And sometimes they would do things like, sneak out of town and say, oh yeah, we're going to fly tomorrow. Don't worry, we'll be back. And then they leave. I think my favorite story actually about the Grahams, and this shows you what kind of people they were, is about what they called the lawn balloon, which is a linen balloon. Linen or cotton. I think lawn has been used for different substances at different times. But anyway, okay, so they've got this balloon George starts using in his early flights, before Margaret, I think, was even on the scene, or before they even knew each other. And it was just too heavy, because he didn't know anything about ballooning at the time, aside from, talking to various people about it. He tried to put it up. It had a very brief flight, and then he sort of retired that one. And he sold it to other people. And so you got these accounts of other people trying to take this balloon up. And at one point, the gas company says, if we had known it was this balloon, we never would have gone anywhere near this. We would not have provided any services to these people. This balloon is horrible. So apparently it gets back to the Grahams. And in the meantime, they're using a more conventional silk balloon. There comes a time when they're in serious debt. And the sheriff says, okay, to pay off this debt, I'm going to confiscate the balloon. So the sheriff hires an agent to go to their house and take over the balloon. So apparently George is out and Margaret's there. We're trying to put together this whole story, based on a court transcript. But apparently she takes that agent, goes out with him to a pub, gets him drunk, and then he says, well, I still need to take the balloon. She says, okay, here's the balloon. And she hands him that lawn balloon, the horrible one, and keeps the one that's actually worth something for herself. And says, okay, you got the balloon, go off. At which, of course, this whole deception is revealed later on. The reporter at the end says, I wasn't going to publish anything about this, but then somebody involved in the situation offered me a bribe to keep it quiet. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in the newspaper. This tells you a lot about the Grahams, just kind of wild, crazy people they are. But they're also, they were also had this very serious side where they were interested in mysticism and alchemy and astrology. They were sincere practitioners, I think. That was a very important part of their lives and their identities.
I love how you laid this out in the book as well, but even things that no one really thinks of, like when they ascended one time, I think it was George ascending and going into a cloud, which sounds like such a very peaceful thing, and then he just got completely soaked and the balloon was just being weighted down and there was danger. And then I think one time Margaret was, one of the things with landing, as you mentioned, is they would try to land and the actual basket, the carriage of the balloon would be scraping off of rooftops, or it would tip over and it would drag Margaret and George like a half a mile. I mean,
yeah,
it's like this is like NASCAR racing. I mean, I don't know. It just seemed crazy to read your accounts of it.
And just to be clear, were other balloonists who were making careers at the time. And what I've read about them, maybe they have an occasional accident. They don't have a string like this. With George and Margaret, it just keeps going. And it is amazing that this is something they were physically and psychologically and financially able to bounce back from each time. They go on to about 1850 or 1854. They had about 3.5 decades of ballooning experience. And once again, able to, they had some gaps in there. They were able to pull themselves together after each one of those. And I think that is really amazing. And that it's sort of a testimony to what they were, how dedicated they were and what they were able to accomplish.
What is the relationship that the Grahams had with some of the other British esoteric luminaries at the time? You've mentioned a few of them, but is there anything else that you want the listeners to know that maybe we haven't touched on yet?
They did business with John Denley, the bookseller, of course. We already talked about their relationship with Robert Cross Smith or Raphael. There's not a lot of detail beyond that. I don't know if they ever met Frederick Hockley. They were certainly very much in the same circles at the time. So I'd like to think that they met a young Frederick Hockley, or even older, because they did have quite a distinguished career when Hockley was himself getting older and collecting manuscripts and that sort of thing. Well, and of course the tie through the Key of Solomon itself, the one that he wrote for them or transcribed. One of the things I do try to chart out in the book is whether they might have known somebody like Francis Barrett, because that's the obvious question, right? Okay, we got this guy. He's into alchemy. He's into astrology. He's into ritual magic. He's flying around in balloons. A couple of decades before George Graham is, but they're both living in London for some time. It's possible they knew each other. I'm certain that George Graham knew of Francis Barrett. I don't know how well they may have known each other, because we have to put this together based on what has survived in terms of the documentary record. The only reason we have insight into some of this is because of the libraries in the UK and the work they've done to preserve some things, like the Wellcome Institute has George and Margaret Graham's alchemical notebook, and the Senate House Library has what is called the Wondrous Magical Scrapbook, which was assembled by Harry Price, the famous parapsychologist, or at least owned by him. I'm not sure who did the compilation of it. But at any rate, it's this wonderful collection of 19th century astrology and alchemical material put together in this, just a scrapbook. It was just like ephemera. It's like programs and letters and things of that sort. And if we didn't have that, there would be a lot more we did not know about the Grahams. There would be this huge gap in terms of their knowledge if these libraries had not done what they did. These libraries are dealing with challenges. The Wondrous Magical Scrapbook provides particular challenges just because of the nature of material in it, and they would really like to do some preservation work on that. Maybe even get that material scanned, which I would love to see. I'd love to have other people be able to see that work and be able to see what a great treasury it is of material on 19th century occultism. Yeah, so I wish I knew more about this. One thing I do get into in the book, and this may be an additional piece for people who are interested in buying it, is the Mercurii, which is a magical order founded by, we believe, possibly by Raphael, the first Raphael, which has been a subject of speculation as to who was the member, who were members, and all these other questions about what they did and that sort of thing. And I've tried to put together my best stab at that, at what this group was. My overall take is not quite as exciting as people might want to think. I do not think there were a lot of famous people in it. I think it was a lot of Raphael and a lot of people who were other astrologers who were working with him. I do not see George Graham as necessarily a member, but that could be due to the fact that we don't have a lot of records of the Mercurii, and some of those are clearly intended as advertising copy. So it's possible they may have changed his initials or something like that. But I think that's an additional piece that I think might draw people to the book, because there have been a lot of people asking about who is this group, who were in it, what did they do, and I try to get into that. I also deal a little bit with Rosicrucians in early 19th century London, because George Graham did define himself in his first publication as a Rosicrucian. I would love to know if he was in touch with any of the other Rosicrucians circulating at that time, or is that just, or he was just kind of proclaiming himself to be a Rosicrucian. I don't have a great answer for that, but once again, if I have this book out there, maybe people will ask questions and they'll be able to consult some sources I'm not able to, and or be aware of something out there, a connection I'm not seeing, and maybe we can go from there and start to kind of put together this picture of early 19th century London occultism, which is always a fascinating field for me.
So, Daniel, we'll definitely make sure to share that and more information in the video description with listeners. We do have a few questions that are hitting on some other topics. One of the questions is from Jorge Quiones, and Jorge is asking, I'd be interested in Daniel's opinion as far as an adaptation of the Golden Dawn system and this type of magic. May this be a replacement of Enochian magic?
I would say that I think the Golden Dawn system is an attempt to create a vast overarching model of the various magical systems that were available at the time and try to kind of bind it all together. And one of the things that I have witnessed, I actually went to a very interesting lecture in New York City a little while ago about the Key of Solomon. And I think that a lot of people try to figure out how this material fits into, that sort of overarching model. And often it doesn't. It's just, this was something that was not taken into account when that model was created. So you're not going to see Oberon or Oberon show up in this material as far as I know. And you could kind of put them in someplace, but is that going to give you an accurate picture of that being? And beyond that, is having an accurate picture of that being important for what you're doing in the system anyway? And, you could say, well, I'm just going to slot in Oberon over here, and I'm going to do something, and it's going to work, and everything's fine. I'm not going to say, well, I can't tell someone not to do that. And, if it's working for them, it's working for them. These rites are often a lot more Christian in nature than what most modern practitioners particularly like, because we have this weird dynamic in modern practice where we have this vast amount of magical material that's out there, that's more and more is being published, and yet it's less and less common to have people who share the worldview that was behind those magical manuscripts. And so it's kind of just like, okay, we have people who I would say are not orthodox, let's say members of the Catholic Church or something like that, and they're taking a look at this and saying, what are we supposed to do with this? There's actually, I think, one blogger who's also an author who I once was reading his blog about fairy magic. He said, yeah, there's fairy magic, so let's look at the Book of Oberon. And I'm like, okay. And then he goes on to say, well, yeah, this is not really how I think about fairy magic, which is valid on one hand, but on the other hand, you're like, okay, well, yeah, this is sort of a different. It's coming from a different paradigm, and then seeing people grapple with that. I'm not going to say there's not different ways to grapple with that. Do I think this will become part of these late 19th century syntheses of magic or the 20th century ones? It's possible, but I think it's going to be some work, and it depends on how dedicated someone is to putting in that sort of work and if they find that to be productive. One thing about a text is basically I have no control over it once it goes up, aside from, the usual questions about copyright and rights and that sort of thing. I can't prevent people from reading a text and making their own interpretations on it, nor would I want to. These books will have a life of their own, and it will be interesting to see where they go.
Speaking of our earlier chat around the ballooning discussion, there is a question from Brad Scott Couture who is asking, has any great known 19th century magician ever had a documented successful balloon flight? If so, who? And as you mentioned, the Grahams were known for many things, but one of them is just their really bad luck in terms of balloon flights. They did have successful flights, but yes. Is there anything you can add on to that with Brad's question?
Okay, Brad. So the question is, how do you define success? I think that's a big question here, because if you stay up for 20 minutes, is that a success? If the balloon goes up and you don't go up with it, is that a success? I don't know why occultists seem to have been not as good at ballooning as other people. And I don't want to say that it's because they were occultists in any way, shape, or form. But thinking about what I remember about Barrett, there seems to be some problems there in terms of people being able to get off the ground. There were successful flights, though. And one of the things I make clear in the book is I'm talking largely about the unsuccessful flights because those were the interesting ones. There are a good number of flights out there where the Grahams were actually able to successfully ascend and come back down, and there was not really an incident. But it becomes much more difficult because you're tracking down articles through regional press, newspapers, or things like that. You're trying to put together a picture, especially based on the fact that sometimes the Grahams advertised a flight and did not go up. And so you have to ask yourself, okay, well, I got this advertisement of something, out in the countryside someplace. Did this happen? I mean, and so it's really hard to put. I tried at one point to put together a list of the known assets for the Grahams, but then I realized this was so questionable that it was just not worth doing. I'd rather not do that, like put out information which is highly questionable than put out something that people are going to look at later and say, boy, this is really, really kind of horrible. And that's where that particular spreadsheet was going. And I was just like, okay, that's enough. But they were able to ascend, and they were able, I'd say their careers as balloonists was a success. Individual flights, maybe not so much.
We have a question, Daniel, from Cody Dickerson, who's saying, Mr. Harms does great work. I'd be curious what his feelings are concerning the current state of organic mouth-to-ear magical praxis in North America, such as hoodoo, Browcary, powwow, Louisiana voodoo, and so on. Do they seem as though they're flourishing, and has the impact of technology aided or impeded the authentic transmission of knowledge and authority?
This isn't a great question to ask me. This is probably a great question for some other guests. I can only talk about my, once again, limited experience. It seems to be doing well. I think that I would be cautious about saying how it's passed down traditionally, because I think that maybe when you use the word tradition, there's always a question of what exactly that means and how much people really in the past did follow what we consider today to be tradition. I think that there have been more avenues opened up with the rise of technology and the internet, in terms of making people aware of what resources are out there, making them aware of where they can get particular substances, making them aware of particular teachers and particular sources, more availability to texts. But it's hard to once again say where that exactly, what exactly has that impact have on these practices, which people were not really talking about already. I would say that probably Brauerei is the one with which I'm most familiar. That seems to be doing pretty well for itself in terms of people being interested, in terms of people having access to more material than before, and in terms of actual practice. I do say that with the caveat, because my main experience with it has been through editing The Long Lost Friend. And one thing I definitely know from that part of my research is that The Long Lost Friend is not necessarily Brauerei in the same sense as it's sort of like this overlapping Venn diagram. So you got your two circles and you got the little bit in the middle. And some people could be practicing The Long Lost Friend and not be doing Pennsylvania German folk healing, and people in Pennsylvania German folk healing many of them are perfectly fine without using A Long Lost Friend. But I think it is something that has been successful, but it's hard to say whether these traditions are, more prevalent or less prevalent than they were in the past, because people really, for the most part, weren't talking about this sort of thing. I mean, it comes up when somebody goes to trial, maybe, or maybe you have somebody like Harry Hyatt who's going around and talking to practitioners, but that's their only glimpse into what exactly, how many people were actually dealing with this at the time. And then you have to deal with, okay, so if this modern practitioner is doing 30% of this practice, or, say that maybe somebody was doing 3 generations ago, is that authentic? What if they are not following the same faith tradition as a person who was practicing this, and that faith tradition has ties to the material being practiced? It's just a really complex question. And I don't feel like I know any of these well enough to be able to answer them, but I can see all the pitfalls in terms of being able to really get a good understanding of it. This would probably have to be somebody who's much more knowledgeable, has spoken with a good number more practitioners than I have.
I think both Cody and the listeners will definitely appreciate the information that you have and kind of coming from your own perspective. So thank you just for sharing that. We also, Daniel, have another question from Pawel Timechio, or Pamwell Timekio. I'm so sorry. I'm probably totally butchering that. But Pawel is asking, can Mr. Daniel Harms share some information from A Complete System of Magic by Society of Esoteric Endeavor from 2018, and if there will be more reprints of this highly interesting position?
It has not been Ben Fernie's philosophy, Ben Fernie of Caduceus books, to run reprints. I can tell you that much. That is usually what his perspective is. He's putting out things that are supposed to be, demonstrations of the bookbinder's art and, beautiful and significant works, but he's not one for saying, well, I want to go back and make a paperback version or something along those lines for the most part. One book I worked on with him was The Experimentum, which is a segment from the Clavis of Solomon that's at Senate House Library. It's a unique treatise. If you've seen the new Skinner and Clark Clavis, there's some overlap with that. There's actually considerable overlap, but it doesn't have that particular treatise in it. He did graciously give me the rights back to that, but I don't think there's a way to get that published, because the diagrams in it are incredibly beautiful, but they are also very difficult to reproduce, because these days, I would say, and this could be me speaking as an academic, and so I may not have perspectives that other people would have. It is relatively easy to get into manuscript collections, and especially in comparison with the past. It's relatively easy to order copies in a lot of cases of manuscripts for personal use or to take photos. When you come to the commercial publication of those images, that's where the fees start kicking in. For my part, it would appear that, yeah, I could put this together, but my gosh, I would have to pay so much for it, and I'm not sure there would be a market for it in terms of getting that book out again. So I'm not quite sure what I can tell someone who would like to get one of these books. I would say they are probably priced out of some people's ranges, and I acknowledge this. Being on the mailing list and buying them may be the shock that most people get. I mean, that may be it.
Daniel, we have one last question from one of the Glitch Bottle patrons who is asking, this is from Mark Todd, who's saying, can you ask why and under what circumstances Daniel decided to pursue his interest in the occult? Was it a choice based upon a personal experience? And I know you touched on at the beginning of the show about how H.P. Lovecraft kind of drew you in, but and maybe this is what Mark is intimating, but did you ever have any kind of experiences that might have intimated some kind of contact with occult entities or some kind of spiritual or otherwise numinous experience? I hope I'm not taking Mark's question out of context, but
if I had an experience, that would not be something I would discuss because I like to be private about these sort of things. What I will say is that I think that I was largely influenced by the fact that just working on the book from a long time ago, which most people have forgotten. It's still in print, though. It's called the Necronomicon Files. And really working with my co-author, John Wisdom-Gans, on understanding the occult side of people who are interested in the Necronomicon and, the sort of books they're interested in reading. And so that's kind of what threw me off on that path. And it's kind of funny, though, because Donald Tyson wrote the introduction to that book, and we didn't know Donald Tyson at the time. John just told me, hey, we should ask Donald Tyson for an introduction to this book. And then I said, sure. So we wrote him, and he was happy to do it. So it was interesting because what happened as a result of that, Donald Tyson and I kind of crossed paths. So I got really into wanting to learn more about historic grimoires and magic and the things of that sort. And Donald Tyson decided he wanted to know more about the Necronomicon. So if you've seen these Donald Tyson Necronomicon books out there, he's got a Necronomicon, I think he's got a tarot deck, he's got a novel, he's got all this other stuff. We inspired that, which was when I wrote a book about how the Necronomicon basically was a hoax that was taken over by modern magicians at the time. That was not what I intended to have happen, but it's mainly just really funny at this point. That's what came out of it. That's kind of how I got into it, because it was just like, oh yeah, there's these other books. Did they influence Lovecraft? And usually the answer is probably not. I mean, everybody tries to bring up the Picatrix as something that influenced Lovecraft, but it's really unlikely. That's sort of what put me off on this path, is just being able to say, hey, there are actually forbidden books of magic. I could read some of those. I took things from there.
Where can listeners find you, Daniel? I know you have a really good blog that if you could share about, and also if they want to check out your publications, if they want to check out other projects and updates, where can they go?
They can go to my blog, which is danharms.wordpress.com. And there's actually a page called Buy My Books, where I have a lot of the books listed. You will find the Book of Oberon there. You will find Of Angels, Demons, and Spirits listed there. I believe I've updated it so it has Balloonists, Alchemists, and Astrologers of the 19th Century in there. That one is available through Amazon. It is print right now. I may be looking at getting a Kindle copy of that available. And there are also some other works there on my page if you want to look at, say, the Lovecraftian side of stuff. Or if you want to know where I've written a couple of chapters in various books, that would also be a good place to be able to track those down. So I kind of just took all those links and put them all in one place.
Daniel Harms, thank you so much just for taking the time out of your very busy schedule and coming on the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
You're quite welcome.
Listeners, that episode with Daniel was very enlightening, and I'm already highlighting passages in the Book of Oberon that are helping to refine my own personal practice. I hope you're doing the same. And also Glitch Bottle patrons, which to my patrons, thank you so much. I'm so grateful for your support. You can also hear exclusive bonus material with Daniel talking about the mysterious magician, Dr. Thomas Rudd. Daniel also gives a peek behind the veil of library science and talks about his other awesome projects going on. And as always, you can support Glitch Bottle with exclusive perks on Patreon, patreon.com/glitchbottle, and you can always subscribe to Glitch Bottle on youtube.com/glitchbottle. Make sure to hit that little notification bell as well. And as always, you can listen to Glitch Bottle on iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker.com, and Stitcher Radio. Okay, listeners, I have to run. I have to make some tweaks to my magical circle layout after this specific conversation with Daniel, and I hope that you are always continuing to delve deep into your own practice. Remember, it's there, just waiting for you to step into the circle. As always, this is Alexander Ath reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.